Okay, so we're up to the last halacha of Siman Yud Aleph, which was all about borrowing, renting, and then incidental to that, we went into the halachas of muzzling an animal, because that's related to what you can and cannot do with an animal that is rented or that you rent out. Okay, so for the last halacha in the Siman, halacha lamed, we have as follows: Poros hamahalchos al hatvua lefi sheyarat lahen haderech eino over al lo sachsom im chasman. So if you have a cow that's trampling on grain, but it's trampling on grain not because that's its function currently, but it's trampling on grain because it needs to get from point A to point B. If you take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, he says, Pirei she'ovros al hatfua derech halichasan l'makom acher kedei lekatzer halichasan. The cow is simply walking from point A to point B, and the shortcut is through the threshing floor, and so it's going to invariably step on wheat and benefit the farmer by actually just trampling on the wheat on its way, right? But that's not what its primary function is. So in that situation, there's no violation of chasima, of muzzling the animal, because that's not its primary work. Even though invariably a certain amount of wheat will end up having been trampled on because of its walking through that place, and therefore, you're going to benefit from its work by its trampling. But that was not your primary intention. Your intention was for the animal to get to point A to point B. So v'chein kol kayotze bazeh, and the same thing would apply in other situations. So as the Imrei Yaakov says over here, hold ve'in miskabin, this was not your intention. Mashma da'afal pi dahavi psik reisha denichalei. It seems from here that even though you know it's going to happen, and you're happy that it's going to happen because you know that those wheat kernels need to be trampled on anyway, mikol makom shari hol ve'inu miskavin lazeh. It's still permitted because that's not your primary intention. The ayin mashakasafti al zeh b'biurim, and I refer you to what I write about this in the biurim, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. Okay. So let's just see if there's anything else that we need to see. So this page is done. Let's see if there's anything on the bottom here. No. So the only thing left for us to see is the biurim on this halacha. So he says, Divrei harav kan tzorich biur. He says the Rav Shulchan Aruch needs to be clarified. The mashma minei demayri shehu maviras aparos derech sham, v'lo shaholchim shamei atzmam. He says you're leading your cows. Let's say you have a bunch of cows, and you're trying to get them from one place on your property to another place, and one convenient passageway is through the threshing barn, and you know that as a result of them walking over the wheat, you're going to end up threshing some of your wheat. It's a win-win, right? He says, and it's permitted because your objective is not that they thresh the wheat, but that they get from point A to point B. He quotes the Mishnah Lamelech, which is one of the primary commentaries on the Rambam as the source for this. Shapasak sham de paros hamahalchos alatvua lefi sheyarat lahen haderech ena over aleim mishum bal sachsa. The Rambam writes those words. He said, if an animal goes off road and ends up trampling on wheat, then it's still okay to muzzle the animal. You don't have to immediately unmuzzle the animal because that's not what its job is. Because of a Mishnah Lamelech v'zelashanu nira be'enai dahachi pirusha. To parazu haisam mahalechas ladush b'tfua sheb'makom acher echad. That what we're talking about is this cow was going to thresh one barn or one pile of grain or one area. And in order to take a shortcut, you pass it over wheat in another place. That it wasn't the intent of the balabayas, of the owner, to thresh it in that place. He says it wasn't the balabayas' intention to thresh there, and therefore it's permitted. We have to really ask the question, why is this permitted? We know there's a general rule that when you know something inevitably is going to happen, that's going to result in an Isser. Like this is most prevalent in Hilchos Shabbos, right? If something is a psik reisha, something will inevitably happen as a result of your primary action, so then so the example of the Gemara is you want to cut off a chicken's head so that your child can play with something. So he wants to have like a little action figure. So they didn't make action figures out of plastic back then, so you give him a chicken head instead. Captain Chicken, right? So the problem is that by cutting off the chicken's head, it's invariably going to die. And killing an animal on Shabbos is a malacha, netilas neshama. And so even though your intention is not to kill the chicken, but if you know the chicken's going to die inevitably, you're not allowed to cut off its head. Okay, so L'chemoshe kasav harash perik beis the psachim siman beis the psik reisha havikim eskavin b'chol isurei deoraisa. That with all biblical prohibitions, you're actually doing the prohibition because it's as if you intend for that outcome to occur, since you know inevitably it's going to happen. Actually, there's other cases outside of Hilchos Shabbos where we're even more machmir. The psik reisha the lo nichale mutter b'Shabbos mikol makom bishari sur and moda da'aser. He says the Sefer Ha'aruch, which is an early Rishon, is of the opinion that even though in Hilchos Shabbos sometimes we're lenient as long as that was not your primary intent and you don't benefit from it, it's permitted, but with other prohibitions, it's aser. Dafka gabi Shabbos shari mishum demlechas machsheves asra Torah, aval bishari sur and aser ayin sham. Because the Aruch says the reason we can be more lenient in certain areas of Hilchos Shabbos is because the only time you're liable for committing a malacha on Shabbos is if it was your specific intent. So in a case where it wasn't your directed, thoughtful intent, but you know it's going to happen as a byproduct, maybe in Hilchos Shabbos you can be lenient. But the imkain kasha my time ashari kanavareu psukreisha denichale that's when the doshal yedezeh. But so here the question is, why is it permitted? You know for a fact that the cows walking along the threshing floor are going to inevitably be trampling on the wheat. You know that that's going to be helpful to you. So why is it permitted? The Tanu Rabbanan Paros Hamirachsos Batvua Aina over Mishum Balsachso. That's the Brisa in the Gemara over there, Peites Amid Beis, says that if you have cows that are Mirachsos, what that means is, we'll see in just a minute, but they're doing something with wheat. In that case, you're not in violation of muzzling. V'nechleku harishonim b'pirish braisazu. There's a machlokus as to what those words mean. The Rashi piresh shorin sa'orin b'mayim, umiyabshin osan b'tanur, v'dashin osan b'paros. He says what people do is they take barley, they soak it in water, they then dry it out in an oven, and then they're trampled on by cows in order to, I guess, to remove the husk, to pearl the barley in some way. The reason why there's no prohibition of muzzling an animal when it's trampling on that barley is because it already became subject to Meiser. And remember, we learned that you only are prohibited from muzzling the animal before the produce it's working with has become subject to tithing. Rama quotes this Rashi. Rambam understands it a different way. And he says, Domishu mefarish baros hamerachsos betfua klomer ovros alatvua derech achilasum amakam acher kedei lekatzer halichasim. Ravid says that's the Rambam understands it according to the way the Rav Shulchan Aruch says it, that they're taking a shortcut, and through their shortcut they're trampling on wheat. V'hamaforshim lo kach pirshu elatvua shenishreis b'mayim berotz lahasher klipasa v'huchush la'ad kan lashono. He says, and the Ravid says that's not how other people understood it. They understood it the way Rashi understood it. Amagid Mishnah Sham Kasav al Zebazilashano, the Ikar HaPerish Kediver Rabbeinu Miloshon, the Harichasim Labik'ah, the Haramban Zal Messiah, Kimidigrasin Birushalmi, Peraktes Shumas, etc., etc., etc. Basically, the commentaries say, the Magid Mishnah says that I side with the Rambam in his interpretation of the Gemara. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this because it's getting now technical and not really, it's getting more lumdus. Okay, so let me just get
it's just improving stuff that's already finished. So this barley is edible and it's done and ready, but you're just making it better. Is that?
According to Rashi, this has nothing to do with the animals taking a shortcut. According to Rashi, you're intentionally bringing the animal to trample on it, but the reason why you're allowed to muzzle it is because it's already subject to Meiser.
It's subject to Meiser because it's finished.
It's already been processed. Right, you're doing an additional processing to it. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay. Okay, he's continuing along this discussion of Psik Resha. And so I'm going to open up the next packet just to look at the conclusion that we get to. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so he doesn't really come up with a real resolution to his dilemma. Another example of a psik resha is where you want to drag a bench to get it from point A to point B on Shabbos. And in the course of dragging it, you're creating a groove in the soil, which is a prohibition of creating, you're not, it's considered to be a form of charisha, of plowing the soil on Shabbos. So that's another example of a psik reisha. So why is it permitted over here when you know that the animal is going to be muzzled in the course of trampling on the wheat? So let me just see. He says, Mikol makom ein lahatir, based on what we've written, we can only permit this rakish shaholchu me'atzman udulo ke'hamishna lamelech. We would only permit the animals to be muzzled if the cows went on their own to walk through the threshing floor, but not that you deliberately led them there. He says, and the point that he says is that what's the chiddush of that? Of course, the cow can walk there muzzled. The answer is because we've learned before that if an animal has a splinter in its mouth, and it can't nibble on the produce that it's working with, you have an obligation to take out the splinter, even though the splinter got in the animal's mouth on its own. You didn't put it there. So perhaps that would be the idea over here, that just like you have to remove the splinter to prevent the animal that prevents the animal from eating, you might think that you have to remove the muzzle here, but the chiddush is that since the cow chose to walk, he says, "Havamina duhu adin hachashu oses achasima biyadayim agam shehabahima holeches me'atzma." Since I'm muzzling the animal, but the animal itself is going to walk over to that area, mikol makom kevin shu habib sikreisha shu dashas hatvu v'nichalei bekach litzeri kamashmon midrasha debedisho below bedarcho deshar. And so the chiddush is that since the animal is not being employed to do that, it's not there to work the grain, then it's still nonetheless permitted for it to be muzzled. So anyway, let me just skip down to see if there's anything else that we need to see here.
I'm not worried about the fact that the animal is being tempted to go by the grain that's there. I mean, I appreciate you haven't led the animal there, but you led it there by putting the grain there and going back to the situation.
Yeah, it's because you didn't lead the animal there.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, and then he goes off into a tangent having to do with the laws of psik reisha. So I don't. Yeah, very good. Anyway, I don't think we need to go into any further detail on this. So let's put this to bed. Let's put our muzzled cows to bed, and let's start the next siman. The next siman is Dine Halva, the laws of loans. Okay. Now it's quite interesting that the laws of ribis are not in Choshen Mishpat. I think I've mentioned this at least a couple of times in the past. The laws of ribis are not to be found in Choshen Mishpat. They are found instead in Yoredeya, which is an interesting phenomenon in that normally all of financial halacha is found in Choshen Mishpat. And I mentioned that the reason why my understanding is the reason why it's in Yoredeya, not in Choshen Mishpat, is Yoredeya talks about things that are usher for a person to do, not because he's harming another person, but rather because the Torah, you're affecting your relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. In other words, there's a bein adam lamakom aspect, right? And the strange thing about ribis is that even when two Jews agree that they will have a loan with interest and you're actually doing the other fellow a favor, it's still going to be usher. Even when both parties benefit, the Torah still prohibits ribis. And that's the reason why I don't think that it belongs in Choshen Mishpat, because clearly there's an added aspect to this halacha that doesn't just deal with the impact to your other Jew that's borrowing the money. So, what will be the scope of this halacha in Choshen Mishpat that the Rav Shulchan Aruch is bringing in Choshen Mishpat? That remains to be seen. But let's see what he says. There's 40 paragraphs, so it's just like it's actually even more lengthy than our previous paragraph as far as number of paragraphs. The previous paragraph had what, 30 or 31, something like that. 30. It had 30 paragraphs. So let's start the new one. So he says, Mitzvah saseh lahalvos la'aniyeh Yisrael. It is a positive commandment in the Torah to lend money to poor Jews. Im yadom aseges, if you can afford it. V'shir hasagas yad misboer behilchos tzedakah. And what does it mean you can afford it? That's explained in Hilchos tzedakah. We'll take a look at the Imrei Yaakov shortly. Now, where do we know about this positive commandment? Shenemar im kesef talve'es ami es he'ani imach. Torah says, if you lend money to my nation, if you lend money to the poor that is with you, okay, and there the Torah uses the word im, which means if you lend money. So it doesn't say explicitly in the Torah, thou shalt lend money. It says, if you lend money, lo tihiyelo kinosheh, lo sisimun alav neshech. Do not be an oppressor and do not place interest on the loan. So it seems like it's my option. I can either lend money or I can choose to not lend money. But if I lend money, I cannot oppress the debtor, and I have to make sure that I don't charge interest. Okay? That's the simple reading of the pasuk. So Yachol Rishus, the Gemara, however, comments on this pasuk, and it says, you might think that it's optional. So Talmud the ha'avet ta'avitenu. You shall lend him with collateral. That's what the word avot means, is take collateral. And there, in that pasuk, the Torah uses the language of thou shalt lend with collateral. Va'af below avot chayev lahalvoso, af liten lo matnas chinam. Now, even without collateral, there's still an obligation to lend him money, and there's an obligation to give a poor person an outright gift, what we call tzedakah. Shaharei nemar nason titain lo. As the Torah says, you shall give him, you shall give to the poor. Va'omer hishamer lecha pen yihiyeh davar im levavacha v'liya'al lemor karava shenasaf sheva shenasa shemitah. So he says that the Torah, he says in parentheses, the Torah says, be very careful if there be something bilial that wants you to throw off the yoke of heaven off of yourself, to say as follows: behold, the 7th year, the Shemitah is coming, and if I lend this fellow money, the loan will be canceled. So, and you, nonetheless, the Torah says, nason titain lo, you should nevertheless give him, and don't feel bad about giving him. He says, v'hamal ve'al ha'mashkon eino mishamet. Al kein af below mashkon chiyivcha hakasuv lahalvos lo. And if a person lends money with collateral, Shemitah does not cancel that loan. Shemitah only cancels a loan that was made without collateral. Now, why does Shemitah not cancel a loan that was made with collateral? Because the loan is already considered paid off. There's nothing for Shemitah to cancel in that case, because the guy can always use the collateral to collect the loan. But if I lend you money, if I lend you $100 and Shemitah elapses and you haven't paid back, so according to the Torah, that loan is canceled unless you do something called a pruzbol, which we're going to be doing before Rosh Hashanah this year, because this year is a Shemitah year. And everybody is going to do a pruzbol when they do Hataras Nadarim on Erev Rosh Hashanah. It's the end of the Shemitah year, cancels debts. Okay. Just 1 second. Sure. So therefore, says the Rav Shulchan Aruch, we can adduce from the fact that the Torah has to command me to not feel bad about giving him a loan, that there's a mitzvah to loan someone money even without collateral. And even if it means that I'm going to lose the money, which means I'm giving him tzedakah and not a loan, I still have a mitzvah to do so. Go ahead, Shmuel.
Yeah, so my question is, the pasuk says im kesef talveh. The word im usually has a number of meanings, right?
Yes, it does.
Can you say that im, not if, but with kesef talveh?
So the word with is spelled with an ayin, not with an aleph.
Thank you.
There's two words im, yeah.
Thank you.
So, but in this particular case, when the Torah says if you lend money, it doesn't mean that it's your option. It means if you lend money that the Torah commands you to lend, then make sure you don't oppress him and don't charge interest. So, but in any event, so let's see where the Rav Shulchan Aruch goes with this. Bottom line is that there is a mitzvah when I'm dealing with poor people to loan them money and to give them money. Why does the Torah therefore then say that you should take collateral when you make a loan? That if the poor person has pride and he doesn't want to take money without and feel indebted and he's embarrassed, so then omrim lo havei mashkon kedei lahagis da'ato shelo yevosh. Then you can tell the poor person, give me collateral. In other words, the collateral is an accommodation for the poor who may be reluctant to borrow money without feeling that sense of I'm covered. Ein li ela ani. Usher should start. So that covers the poor man, that there's a mitzvah to lend him money. So then the Gemara says, but that's all well and good that there's a mitzvah to lend a poor person money. Asher shetzarach lilvos minayin shemitzvah lahalvoso lefisha. How do you know that there's also a mitzvah to lend money to a person who is of means? Let's say a person is not poor, but he needs to put together a down payment on a home. And so he goes to his friends and family and says, can you lend me a few $1,000s? I'm just putting together some money for a down payment. So do I qualify as an ani? No, I'm not an ani, but I'm not going to be able to buy a house unless I borrow money. So how do we know that there's a mitzvah to lend such a person money, even though he's an ashir, even though he's not poor? So Talmud Lomar es ami, because the pasuk says, my nation. Ba'afilu, and where does this pasuk appear? I'm trying to remember the language of the pasuk. So let me just see. It says in kesef talveh et ami, if you lend money to my nation, and then it says es he'ani imach, including the poor. So you see the word et ami is inclusive of the poor, but not exclusively the poor. Ba'afilu imba lefanav nachri lilvos mimenu beribis, the Yisrael asher bechinam ha'Yisrael kodem. He says, and therefore, if a Gentile comes to you who is willing to borrow money and pay you interest, and a Jew comes to you and wants to borrow that same money, but you know that he can't pay interest because that's a violation of the Torah, it is a mitzvah to loan the money to a Jew before you loan the money to a Gentile. Even though you won't be making interest on it, and the Gentiles offer to pay you interest, you still have a mitzvah to lend the money to a Jew first. Im tzarech lahotzi hamos leparnasaso. If he needs that money for his parnasa, for his sustenance, we'll see what that means. B'dei machsoro, and he needs to make up what he is lacking. In other words, but if the Jew needs it for some other purpose, to invest and to enterprise, to use it for an enterprise, like let's say he wants to borrow money from a Jew so that he can lend it to a Gentile to earn interest on it. So then I have no obligation to lend him the money if I can make interest myself. O bishar masa umatan, or for any other enterprise. Shenemar es ami. And the Torah says, we know this because the Torah says, my nation. And my nation includes even Jews who are not poor. Ami kodem l'nochri. That my nation comes before the Gentile. So we're going to have to finish this halacha tomorrow. Then we're going to have a lot of Imrei Yaakov and other commentary to go back on. So bear in mind, we're in the halachos of lending, the mitzvah of loaning money. And we'll see whether we get onto the issue of ribbis or not. So have a good day, everybody.
Well,